Welcome to the Independence by Design podcast, where we discuss what it means to be a business owner and ways to get unstuck from the day-to-day so we can design a business that gives us a life of independence. Welcome back, everybody. Today, we are going to be talking about how to scale and optimize a professional services firm. I think this is super important because about a third of the economy are professional services firms. I think a lot of people listening in have a services aspect of their business, and there was no one better to have on the show to talk about this than Marcel Petitpas, who is the founder of Parakeeto, as well as the co-author of a book called Software as a Science, Unlocking Limitless Recurring Revenue Without Losing Control. Marcel has been in the agency space, helping agency owners optimize their operational efficiencies, tie the operations to the financials to answer the most important questions we all have, which is, am I making enough money on this client? Am I packaging up my services the right way? How do I move from time and material to maybe a outcome-based service offering or pricing? Or anyways, there's a lot of different questions that we all have. And Marcel put it perfectly. Like, these are simple questions, but they're very difficult to get the answers to. And Marcel has spent most of his professional career trying to answer those questions. And he's created a framework for professional services firms to help them understand what KPIs should be paying attention to, how to take in sequential order and unpack where you're at right now, where do you need to be, what KPIs you need to focus on, so that way you're making enough money to make it all worth it. And this is an episode you're absolutely going to love. Marcel's got a podcast. You can go check out his book. And if you want to know more about Marcel and what he's doing, check out the show notes below. Otherwise, I really hope you enjoy this episode. All right, brother. I'm excited to have you here, Marcel. I'm very grateful that we got to do round two of this. You have had a lot of stuff going on. Same thing with me over the last 5-6 months since we originally, I think we got connected prior to that, but you've launched a book. Your agency that is helping agencies is rocking and rolling. Why don't you just give the listeners just a quick cliff note of like what you have going on right now, Marcel? Because I want to go back and give the context to why you built what you did, because it's really effing hard. I've tried to do it, and I give you props. And I'm excited for the listeners to dive in.
All right. There's two major swim lanes that my professional life fall into. The first is Parakeeto, the company that I'm CEO and co-founder of. And our whole mission is to help agencies and professional services companies measure and improve their profitability. And there we've built, a full service consulting and technology solution that helps essentially take over the whole operations and finance reporting function within a firm and helps them make better management decisions. So, that's been a 6-year journey. We're having lots of success with that now.
I bet you it's super easy, right? Yeah.
Yeah, we'll get into that. It was 6 very, very hard years. I feel like we didn't really figure it out until about 18 months ago, maybe 2 years if I'm being generous. But that's been amazing. And through that, I've had the chance to travel the world, speak all over the place, spend a lot of my time speaking and educating people and running workshops on and creating educational content and courses on this subject, which I'm very passionate about. And that's probably my favorite thing that I get to spend my time doing is educating people. I think you and I share that passion and quality. And then similar to that, but in kind of a different swim lane, is my involvement with SaaS Academy, which was created by Dan Martell. I was the first coach to ever coach people in SaaS Academy that wasn't Dan.
Oh, no way.
I've had the pleasure
I didn't know that.
of being involved in that organization since the very early days. I saw it grow from, just a handful of people to, a team of 60 plus, become one of the largest coaching programs in the world for entrepreneurs, and of course the largest in B2B SaaS. And recently had the opportunity to work on publishing a book with Dan and the two other co-founders in that business, Johnny and Matt, and that launched recently and became a bestseller. So that's been a lot of fun as well.
That's awesome, Marcel. And it's I didn't know you were at the early stages with Dan, like with the first coach, because and you just recently outsourced, or not, I wouldn't say outsourced, but Dan Martell words, bought back your time with hiring a salesperson to replace yourself. And I think as we dive into professional services, you guys specialize in agencies, but I think what's very applicable to anybody in professional services, and I've had multiple firms that I've scaled in varying degrees of success on professional services, and it's really hard. And you guys have dove into that, and you've been living and breathing what you teach too. And it sounds like you've got into the liftoff period, man, which is just awesome. And props to you, man.
Yeah, it's really exciting, but to your point, it can be very difficult. That's the thing that nobody wants to talk about in professional services especially if you're, an entrepreneur, you probably get ads all the time in your news feed from people who are saying things like, oh, it's never been easier to start an agency. It's never been easier to start a consulting firm. And that's true. It has never been easier to start, but it's also never been harder to scale, because the business model has gotten infinitely more complex since we've moved on from this era of time and materials being kind of the strictly only way to do things. That has added a lot of complexity to early stage businesses. And a lot of the stuff that used to work in terms of how you manage the business just doesn't work anymore. It's not compatible.
Which we're going to dive into a lot of your expertise on this specific topic. What was the hardest? Like, I mean, you've been in professional services. What is the hardest part about scaling? Because you can start as long as you got yourself and got some knowledge and can solve a problem. But like, what is some of the bottlenecks or the biggest pinch points?
Yeah. Well, for Parakeeto, it's kind of twofold. The first is that we were solving a very complex, nuanced, and technical problem. So there was this whole story of how do we find product market fit, and then be able to create a process around that was scalable, which leads into the second part of this, which is being able to sell and deliver a service to a client is challenge number one. That's finding product market fit. That is hard for everyone, and it how hard that is depends to the degree of which you're taking on something that's novel or complex or technical. And then part two is, can you get scalable unit economics within that business model? In other words, can you make enough margin for long enough to have the cash flow to fund growth and to be able to make all the investments that are necessary to grow? Because as you know, growing is expensive. It requires a lot of cash. And it's a really, really easy trap to fall into in professional services, especially where you can have the illusion of profitability because you have cash flow that's kind of disconnected from, on an accrual basis, how you earn your revenue. You can have the illusion of profitability because in the early days as a founder, you're subsidizing a lot of costs inside of the business with your time. And those things can catch up to you, and you can run into a brick wall pretty quickly and realize, hey, you know what? I've not designed my business around a set of pricing and delivery costs that actually give us the money that we need to scale. And that's a really hard problem to solve once you've already kind of started building a business on top of a set of assumptions that didn't end up actually being reasonable.
Why is it hard once you've built the business on these assumptions? I mean, I've got my own experience with knowing that answer, but like, or my own experience of that answer, but
Well, it's a lot of reasons, but for starters, you now have to go back and rethink a lot of things that you think are validated, right? So let's say, for example, you figure out that you need to double your delivery margin and you don't think that you can close that gap through efficiency. And so you figure, okay, I need to double my price. Well, whatever your sales funnel numbers were before, they're now back on the drawing board. And how long will it take you to revalidate that your unit economics make sense, that you can even sell this thing for that price? How is your customer acquisition cost going to change? So a lot of the fundamental assumptions that got you to that place are probably going to have to get rethought. Maybe that's going to change who you're targeting. It's going to change what segment of the market you're going after. So there's a lot of kind of fundamental things that are probably going to get rocked with that. But the second reason that it's difficult is because it's not instantaneous. Like, a lot of people talk about raising their prices like it's going to be this thing that overnight is going to fix a lot of your problems. And certainly if you go back to your existing clients and say, hey, your prices are going to go up overnight, then that might be the case. But if you're approaching this with saying, okay, we're only going to change prices for new clients that are going to come in, then there's going to be a long process by which you start to actually solve the indigestion that's happening inside of the business. And so you might come to this realization and need 12, 18, 24 months or longer to actually have that change see itself all the way through and really have the impact that you need to have on the business.
oh, dude, I have lived that nightmare multiple times in multiple businesses, managed IT services, the CFO services, and then the financial modeling. And like, to your point, like, because I went through like raise price, raise, and then but like you look at your funnel and you're like, well, I've already locked in this shitty situation with my expectations, with my clients, my people, my payroll. Like, so there's like the crappy part, like what you said, the indigestion locked in. And then I look at my funnel and like, I've already, like, the reason the funnel's there is because I've spoken to someone and they generally understand the pricing. So then you're like, okay, well, I have to like figure out how to either recalibrate or say yes or no. And so, yeah, it's just, and like, it's so fascinating, Marcel, because it's like the chicken or the egg that I've experienced with services. Where like in the IT services space, where we found out that there was people that were, essentially subsidizing their professional services with something else. And what happens is like, if you try to compete with them, you would be locking yourself into a crappy cost structure, which then you couldn't even deliver what you wanted to. So do you like hire the right people and lose money until you load them up? I mean, it's hard, man. How do you handle like that transition period with people or for yourself in the past?
Yeah, well, there's a big sequencing question. So let's assume that you're not in a situation where you can just go back to all of your previous clients and raise your prices and just not have to worry about churn. Um, then the next best thing to do, let's assume that there are a lot of recurring clients. Okay, we'll start with that assumption for
Okay.
this scenario. Certainly in managed IT, that would typically be the situation. You'd probably have a lot
Or
of
even
implementation.
agencies, or I mean, like, and I
Yeah.
think is it before we keep going, sorry, because I'm using my own experience, but like, is this effective? I mean, professional services across the board, agency, because you have payroll as your biggest expense, and then some sort of delivery, whether it's a contract or I mean, we'll get into T&M versus contracts, but like, is that a safe statement?
We have worked across pretty much every vertical within professional services. We've gone into consulting, accounting, legal. So what we've observed is that these conventions are very similar across the board because the fundamentals of the business model are basically the same. Although, yeah, just to anchor this, the vast majority of our anecdotal experience comes from working with 95% plus of our clients have been in the creative or digital agency space. So with that in mind, the sequencing that's important here is the best time to start replacing clients within the organization is when utilization is high. I think the mistake that a lot of people make with pricing increases is they just jump to making pricing increases and then they go and start firing clients. That's been a kind of a really fun thing that coaches and consultants like to talk about. They like to celebrate this idea of firing clients, but like the context around that is really important. Where if you reach this point where you might need to hire someone if you close that next deal. So the team is really maxed out. That is the best possible time to then go to a previous client that you know has much lower margins than what you're selling new clients at today, and then have a conversation about, hey, client, it seems like your needs have changed since we first started working together. I want to make sure that we have enough scope to properly support you and meet those expectations. Here's what would need to be true for us to do that. And then if they say no, you're in this wonderful position where there's no opportunity cost. You could say, hey, no problem. Let us find you a new partner that can meet your needs. And you replace that capacity with higher quality revenue. We had a client once we did an audit with that had almost exclusively recurring revenue. And this was their biggest problem. They had grown the business substantially. They had a bunch of legacy clients, some of which were actually costing them money each month. Like their labor costs exceeded what the client was paying them. It was wild. And we showed them how they could grow 60% year over year and increase their profits by 500% just by replacing clients. And so the game for them was anytime you're kind of really maxing out utilization, don't start hiring people and continue throwing clients on top of the pile. Take a break, go start renegotiating your contracts. If clients accept the new deal, perfect. Move up to the next client, repeat the process, and do that until all the indigestion is gone. Then go back to growing. So from a sequencing perspective, that's a really important consideration because you won't really get the upside from increasing your prices in the short term if it destroys your utilization. Those things will offset each other and your absolute profitability will not improve in the short term. And then you'll be put in a position where you're going to be incentivized to go back to discounting. Because when you need the work to keep your team busy, it's really, really hard to
Yeah,
stand your
yeah,
ground
no,
on
I love,
pricing
well,
well.
yeah, because I mean, and by measuring that utilization and being, I mean, what you got to have the data, you got to have the tracking and the process and the procedures set up the right way in order to do that. But I mean, you're either getting your funding through your current clients and replacing them. I mean, you're just, I had this Tracy Beck, there's a couple people I want to introduce you to, 60 Minute CFO. She wrote a book called 60 Minute CFO. And she talked about when she had an e-commerce business, she just managed her clients like a portfolio. I mean, that's really effectively all you're doing, right? I mean, you're helping people manage their clients as a portfolio, looking at the margins, utilization, so that way, instead of going to hire someone, you're just either A, getting the price you should be getting or receiving from your current client, and then having that up, and then being able to. I mean, yeah, it's a fantastic sequence. I love how you put that.
Yeah, the
Where
sequencing is really important when you talk about the different levers that you can use to improve profitability.
So before we continue going down the rabbit hole of geekiness, which I'm pumped for, where did your passion for all this come from, Marcel? Like, why spend 6 years beating your head against the wall trying to solve a problem about pricing and operational data in agencies?
So, I'd like to say that it's because I experienced it when I ran my own agency briefly, but I don't think that that's really where it comes from. That certainly the interest came from that. So, I ran an agency briefly in my early entrepreneurial days when I was trying a whole bunch of different things. One of the things that I tried was doing virtual reality services for real estate agents. Before you could like do it with your iPhone, we would go in with a camera, take a bazillion pictures, create 3D images, stitch them together. It was a very laborious process. And I ran into challenges having horrible unit economics in that service business where we'd get paid like a couple $100 to do this thing that took like 30 hours of labor to do. So very early in that business, right, I realized like, okay, this can't be anything more than a hobby for me. And I ended up walking away from that business. So when I got a phone call from my friend Jared to start this company, he basically described his pain point of running a much larger firm than I'd ever run doing software development. Said, look, I spend like 2 days a week in spreadsheets trying to answer these questions that are simple but not easy to answer. Like, are we busy enough? Are we making money on our clients and projects? Do we need to hire people? If so, when? Like, what if we do get this deal? What if we don't? Right. So, all the things that you're doing as you run a professional services business that have to deal with this relationship that's quite complicated between people, projects, and finances and sales. He was like, there's got to be a better way to do this. So, that's what got me started on this. And what kept me going, I think, was just the nonstop validation that this was a huge problem that was wildly unsolved. And despite the fact that you have a crazy amount of CFOs that are specialized in the agency space and a crazy amount of COOs and a crazy amount of CEOs that really care about this, there was just nobody really stepping all the way into like the heart of this problem to say like, let us figure out how to actually make all these things work together. And it became very clear that like somebody was going to have to do that. And if they could figure out how to do it, then we'd be solving a massive problem that everybody I spoke to had and didn't really know how to solve.
Oh, dude, brother, I love it so much. So many questions about that experience. So one is, you mentioned how you said easy questions but hard to answer, and I like how you worded that. Describe what you mean by that.
So yeah, it's like questions that are simple and easy are not the same thing. And I think that that's like a pretty good way to describe entrepreneurship in general, right? Like pretty much everything you have to do in entrepreneurship is simple. Very little of it is easy. So if you think about like a question like, am I making money on my clients and projects? Well, it's a pretty simple concept, right? In principle, how much am I getting paid? And what is it costing me to deliver that? The problem is, if you've ever tried to actually double click on either of those parts of the question, all of a sudden you're like, wait a second, this is kind of complicated, right? So
You just
how much
emerge
am I
out of
getting
a cave after like 7 years in your business just to answer that
Yeah.
one question.
Right. And so just in case some of you have never gone down this rabbit hole before, allow me to scare you for a moment. Okay. So how much am I getting paid? Well, okay, the client's paying me a certain amount of money, but then I have these contractors and I have these hard expenses and I have this outsourced third party partner that I bring in to do a portion of this thing. And I have these software expenses that are part of this. And then I have this kickback that I get from one of the software vendors. So does that count as income or not?
And sometimes
And
we travel and expense reimbursements.
right? All this stuff, I mark some of this stuff up and some of this stuff I don't, right? So how much am I actually getting paid for this? All of a sudden is actually kind of a complex question to answer. And how do I make sure that I do this in such a way that I'm normalizing across everything that I sell, no matter what those variables look like, so I can actually compare them to each other and have it be apples to apples. And the same kind of complexity exists for what it's costing us. Well, okay, what do I include in that cost basis and what do I not include? And okay, the people's time that are working on this, well, how exactly do I calculate their average cost per hour? Do I include just their salary? Do I include all the other things that get loaded into their salary? What about overhead costs? Should those be included? Should they not be included? If they are included, then how do we amortize those into specific clients? And what about the fact that that fluctuates all the time? And do we include time off and holidays? And what about utilization, right? So all of a
Sometimes
sudden,
they do some work for the company too, as well as also
Right.
clients.
yeah, exactly. Though, and 100% of their time is not. So how do I factor all of those variables in there? And all of a sudden you realize you're like, oh shit, this is super complicated. And it's part of this constantly moving puzzle that is inherent about a service-based business, which is people, projects, and time are interconnected with sales and new business and scoping and pricing and finance and budgets and overhead. And those things, it's a constantly moving puzzle. And if anything changes in one of those areas, it has impacts on everything else. And so how do you make sense of all of that and develop a system that allows you to actually make good decisions, run the business, look into the future, and have it all actually make sense at the end of the day. Because if you solve for one of these questions and then zoom out and go to try to solve the 5 or 6 other questions and make slightly different decisions, all of a sudden you realize like, oh shit, I need to go reevaluate everything all over again. And it's a goddamn mess, right?
Oh, I'm only laughing because I've lived the effing nightmare. Like, and what's fascinating is if we double click on all of that stuff, which is my passion, which is that's just the effing income statement, dude. And there's nothing to do with like how much cash will be in my checking account, because what if you're doing accrual versus cash, and like what if you're hiring ahead, and it's so, dude. Marcel, when you and I first met, like I think we just went on that, this huge rabbit hole about all this stuff. And like, so how have you wrapped your head around how many people have that information? And then how have you personally processed, dude, how many people are guessing at what they're doing every day?
It's honestly at 6 years in, it's different because we've published so much free content. So I don't want to take all of the credit for this. There are people that came before us that were doing a lot of really good stuff around education in this space. But today, with people having consumed a lot of our free stuff, which, we give it all away, like how to think about this, the formulas, the metrics, the number is a lot higher than it used to be, but it's still, the nuances are still evading
in the agency space, you would say,
yeah.
Right? Because I mean, you're hanging out with Martel and Jason Swank. Is it Swank, right?
Yep.
I see you guys, and then there's a bunch of other people that we know that I've realized that we're all sharing common people with. But like, just in professional services, I mean, what size of the economy is professional services now? I mean, it's like an enormous amount of the economy.
Yeah, it's got to be close to a third, and especially
I think so too. Yeah.
It's coming back in style. Even in SaaS, you're seeing professional services come back in style as all of a sudden venture capitalists are using this word they've never used before called profit. They care about this all of a sudden, right? So
cash
now
flow,
they're like, wait a second. What if we actually charge for all the human capital that's required to scale a software company that we just pretended didn't exist before, like onboarding and customer success and support and custom integrations and all these things, right? Like all this stuff that we used to charge for and still charge for in enterprise. I mean, if you've ever bought Salesforce before, you can't even smell Salesforce for less than $250,000 in professional services. So it's services are back in a big way, and it is alarming how few companies, even at scale, really seem to have a grip on this. And I think most importantly, have alignment on this. I think that's the biggest reason that this is important to me. Is it's the story I hear over and over and over again. I mean, like I had a call recently with a company, several hundred employees. They have a C-suite, and their biggest problem is nothing gets done because they get into a meeting and they spend the whole time arguing about semantics and about differences of opinion on how a metric should be calculating, instead of just agreeing on the facts and working together to solve stuff. It's such a problem, and that's just an alignment issue, right? And so to them, it's like the ROI could just be not even any of the outcomes that will come from having alignment, but just the fact that they don't have to waste any more time on trying to decide what the right way to calculate what these things are, or having the same metric, but both parties are looking at it differently, but they don't even realize that that's happening. And so they're coming up with these wildly different measurements because they never actually sat down to discuss exactly what it meant to them and how they were calculating it and why. Like this stuff is happening all over the place, and it's just getting in the way of teams working together on the right things.
Yeah, dude, amen. And like, so like kind of thread the needle back to even what I'm doing on the ownership framework, Marcel. I mean, I've even since we spoke, I don't know how many workshops I've done. It's half a dozen or dozen or something like that. So a couple hundred more people at least have been through the material. And like, because I can get down to the cash flow statement, the distributions, and then the equity valuation, right? And like, that's the KPI scorecard. Like the only thing that matters in capitalism is sustainable cash flow, which equals equity growth. The normalized you put in the multiple, however you want to calculate, it's free cash flow times like the risk of that cash flow. And obviously human capital, I'm a big proponent of conscious capitalism and all this stuff. But I say this because the fact that you're having those conversations on ops and finance, and I'm coming at it from the ownership perspective. It's like, okay, alignment. And the reason I'm bringing this up is alignment. Like, what the hell is everyone doing? If you're just like, if the CEO is not focused on taking the income statement, the balance sheet, the cash flow statement, creating more cash flow, more equity value, what the hell are you doing? Like truly, and then like you break it down to the functions, the sales and marketing, the ops, and then the finance, and you're like, all of that needs to roll up. And like the fact that that many people aren't just focused on that, which is the ultimate, that's the goal, right? So like, I just find it so fascinating, dude. And like, are you finding it that like your people understand that stuff? Or is it back to the simple question, hard answer where they know that, but they're just trying to compile this puzzle together that you're working with? Or like, what are you seeing?
Yeah. So I think it's a couple of things. I think the first one is that if we're being honest, there are a lot of people running big, especially agencies, but I would also say professional services firms that don't actually understand their business model at a fundamental level. Like they don't really have mastery over it. So part of it is that it's almost like you were trying to operate, I don't know, some machinery, but you don't even really know what buttons are available to you and what each of them do. I think that's the experience that a lot of teams are having running their professional services firm, where they don't really understand at a nuanced level, like what are all the different ways that I can improve my profitability. And a lot of times they don't understand the separation between, for example, management accounting and an accrual lens on their business versus cash-based accounting or tax-based accounting. Like, so there's a lot of signal, like the signal to noise ratio is not great for them, which leads to the second problem, which is, to your point, they're kind of wading through all of this information that they don't know how to make sense of to try and get some clarity and make decisions. So it's almost like if you dumped a box full of puzzle pieces in front of someone and said, go ahead, put the puzzle together, but you never showed them the picture on the front of the box. I think that that's the experience a lot of people are having, trying to wade through all of the different KPIs and metrics and different perspectives that they're often encountering without having an understanding of where to place all of that information and how to qualify it. Where like you've had this experience, I'm sure, where you meet with like your accountant who they're coming from this perspective of like, I'm here to do your taxes. So they're giving you a certain lens on the business, but unless you know that, okay, they're here to do my taxes, you don't know what to pay attention to and what not to pay attention to. You're not able to discern like information that they're giving you that's actually going to be like trying to obfuscate your business's performance to lower your taxable income versus maybe a CFO that's giving you management accounting reports, which will probably look pretty different than your tax accounting reports. Why those things are different, why their perspective is different, what job they were hired for, just simple ideas like that. If you don't have that level of clarity, then your experience as a CEO, CFO, COO in an organization getting information from all over the place is going to feel pretty overwhelming and chaotic.
Yeah. Well, and my favorite phrase, Marcel, is context provides clarity. And the context is the game of capitalism and then how operations ties to finance. I mean, that context provides like, okay, well, what do we do with this situation? How do we go back to our client and ask them for a raise? And if they say no, what is the ramification of that? And I think a lot of this is based off of fear, because it's like, okay, well, if I do that and I lose out on that $50,000 contract, even though I'm losing money, the revenue is paying my payroll. And like I, as the owner, want to make 250 in distributions while hiring my CEO. Like, and then there's just this like huge constraint of cash flow. And there's no context to say this one thing, that this lever, those buttons that you told me that you want, I should press. I don't know the ripple effect of all that stuff. Where did you, like when you, so like along your journey, Marcel, like I think it's interesting how you, in one of your comments, you mentioned about ops and finance. I have seen a enormous dysfunction of those two being completely siloed, and explain why that's so dangerous.
It's dangerous because they're inherently related. And so to treat them as any other way is just kind of disconnected from reality. And I think anyone that is trying to solve this problem right now understands the pain of this. And it's crazy because there was a time when there was a fairly linear flow of data and professional services from ops to finance because everything was time and materials billing. So there was actually a sequential nature to the way that this worked. You sold a certain amount of scope, you worked a certain amount of time against it. That then went to finance. Finance billed for it, and then they would be able to figure out, to a large extent, the profitability metrics. But today, the vast majority of revenue flowing through professional services business is abstracting time and cost, as well as time and money and revenue. So you don't have this straight line of just like we sell something, we work a certain number of hours, we get paid for those hours, and then we have a certain amount of profit. It's more nuanced than that. So there's very much this unilateral flow of information and dependencies that happen between those two things. And so the big danger that I find is the thing that we see all the time is finance and operations are telling two completely different stories about the same situation. So like the classic example of this is the owner that's looking at their P&L and they're like, we're not profitable. So they go to their CFO, and their CFO goes, "Oh, well, you're overstaffed. And I know that you're overstaffed because your, revenue is X, your costs are Y, and your profit is, too low. So you either need to lower your costs or increase your revenue." And the owner says, "Well, this doesn't make any sense, because when I talk to my operations manager and I tell them that we need to cut staff, they're telling me they're super overworked and I need to hire 5 more people tomorrow because everyone's super stressed out. So what the hell is going on?" And therein lies the problem, is that firm clearly doesn't have a strong enough understanding of their gross margin, or as I like to call it, delivery margin. We could talk about why I want to use different language, but the long and short is, I don't want to argue with accountants over semantic issues.
I do.
And specifically, they don't have enough visibility into the 3 things that actually influence their gross margin, which are operational in nature. Right? There's only 3 reasons that your delivery margin isn't good. Either your utilization is low, that would be an overstaffed issue, so the CFO would be right in that case. Could be that your average billable rate is low. So in that case, like the one I'm describing, what's probably actually happening is that they think they're billing out at a certain amount per hour, but they're spending way more time than expected doing things. And so their actual rate is much lower than what they think they're billing to the client. And then the third reason would be that your average cost per hour is much higher than you expect. In other words, your labor costs are high relative to the capacity that you have. So probably you're relying on more senior people than you otherwise should be. And therefore your payroll is higher than it otherwise should be, because maybe you're missing out on some opportunities to get more junior or less expensive people doing a larger share of the work. That's it. There's only 3 levers that really drive the fundamental baseline of profitability in a professional services firm, which is delivery margin, or you could think of it as gross margin. That's like, if that's healthy, then everything else is just optionality, really.
Even with like a lot of like software loaded costs, I mean, how many subscriptions people are having, whether they're building out their own tech or whether they're relying on someone else's tech and they're a value-added reseller. I mean, how does that impact?
If we're talking about, this is where it gets nuanced. So if you're talking about software that's used to deliver for clients, there's kind of 2 different ways to look at that, and it depends on the context. So the first way of looking at this is pass through. So a good example of this would be if you can directly attribute the cost of that software to that client and it scales incrementally. So a good example of this would be like, I don't know, if you're setting up, like if you ran an accounting firm.
Well, even like agencies don't, I mean, you can use agency stuff, which they're like, they have a HubSpot account that they're managing for their clients, or like a Hootsuite or whatever the hell they're doing for their clients.
Exactly.
Right?
So if they're collecting the Hootsuite or the HubSpot payment each month from the client and then passing a certain amount of that on to HubSpot, then they would consider that to be a pass-through expense. And if they mark it up, that would flow through to what we would call their agency gross income. So an example, let's say they're getting $10,000 a month from that client to manage their HubSpot. They spend $2,000 of that on the HubSpot license each month. That's an $8,000 agency gross income client for that agency. So that's one way to think about the expenses. The other is what we call shared delivery expenses. So a better example of this would be like, oh, you have a Figma subscription for your design team. Well, you're not canceling that, and it's not incrementally going up or down for every client that you do or don't have going on at a given time. That's like a tool that your team has in their tool belt, and they bring it to the job kind of no matter what. So if you like ran a plumbing company, this would be like you have a bag of tools in the truck. It's like, it doesn't really matter how many clients you have going on at every given moment. You need that bag of tools in the truck at all times. So that becomes a shared delivery expense. So you're not necessarily attributing that directly to each project, but you have to consider it in the cost of running the delivery function in the business. So it becomes part of this bucket of expenses we call indirect delivery expenses that you have to account for when you're setting your targets as an agency. And generally, we see those software costs be anywhere from 4 to 6% of a firm's delivery costs. But there are exceptions to that. Like we worked with a firm that did a bunch of data services. And so they had these like enterprise data libraries that they were paying for that were hundreds of thousands of dollars. So they had significantly higher shared delivery costs, but they also had really, really high direct margins on their services because they were arbitraging these things. So it all came out in the wash and they ended up with good gross margins in the end.
That's awesome. Very actionable. So going back to the question of it, kind of giving us the context of ops and finance. I mean, they're like, I had Jack Stack on my show it's been a couple times, it's been a little bit, but he's like, the income statement is the best KPI dashboard ever. And like, I think it's so interesting how many people come out with these dashboards trying to come up with these operational KPIs, but they don't tie to the financials. And it's like, it's the same goddamn thing. think it's just two sides of the same coin. And so how are you, like when you look at what an ideal dashboard with KPIs should be, what do you think that they should consist of, and how is it incorporating ops and finance and synthesizing the two?
Yeah. I don't even know that thinking about it as like a dashboard is even the right frame of mind. I think it's more of like a sequence of insight and a sequence of thinking, and it's the sequence that we actually use when we start working with a new client. Um, because part of it is, so here's a big idea, right? You have the plan and you have the actuals. You need both sides of that equation in order to get insight. And I think you've probably run into this lots of times, and people listening have probably run into this a lot of times. If you just have one or the other, then you have information, but you don't feel like you have insight. So like it's one thing to get, let's say you're measuring your utilization rate or you're measuring your gross margin. You get a read back. Oh, it's X%. Well, without understanding what you expected it to be in the first place, that's not actually a very insightful piece of information. It's hard to know how to act on that unless you know what it could have been versus what it actually is. It's like, well, is it high? Is it low? Is there opportunity to make it better? Did we miss? Like, what actually happened there? And so it's like the degree to which you're going to take action from that is limited because you don't have both sides. So in all things being equal, if you have nothing, should you start with the plan or should you start with the actuals? And generally speaking, we start with the plan. And there's a couple of reasons for that. It's usually faster. It usually doesn't require us to have any historical information or go back and clean it up and transform it and normalize it, which is a very expensive and laborious process. We also probably won't know how to properly format that actual data unless we know how we're structuring our plan in the first place. And there's no amount of measuring actuals that will fix the problem of we planned to fail and didn't know it, which is way more common than you would think, right? So we always start with, we have kind of three phases that we go through with clients. Number one is we want to assess their business model. And that's really a function of connecting the dots between operations, finance, and their pricing model and saying, okay, here's your team. Here's how much everyone gets paid, how many hours they work, where their time gets spent in the business, how much of it is on clients, how much of it is on sales and admin and other things, their time off policy, all of that stuff. So now we have a model of capacity. Here's how much time is available for each thing. Here's where your payroll is going, right? At any given moment, this is your model for capacity. Here's your maximum utilization that you could accomplish. And if you apply an average rate to that, here's roughly how much revenue you should expect this team to be able to generate.
How many people have just that information?
Very few. I would say actually there's a decent amount that have, CFOs or COOs that are adequately passionate about solving this problem that have tried to build some form of this in a spreadsheet somewhere. Now, of course, there's tons of nuance to all the little details around how that thing gets formatted.
So some people are doing it, but maybe missing 30% of the equation or something like that.
Yeah. Or they're just, how exactly do you calculate utilization? I mean, do we want to go down that rabbit hole? What exactly is someone's capacity? What exactly do you do with time off and holidays? Is that included? Is that not? So like, there's a whole bunch of nuance to making sure that math actually makes a lot of sense. But I would say there's a decent number of people that have tried to go down that path, but very few feel like that is as dialed as they want it to be. And importantly, it's connected to finance in the way that they want it to be. So that's the second part of the equation, is then saying, okay, let's look at our financial budgets. How much do we expect to spend on overhead, sales and marketing, admin, facilities, et cetera? And with that model, all we've done really is taken assumptions about the business and structured them in such a way where we can now look and say, okay, if everything goes exactly the way we expect it to go, this is the best outcome that we could expect. This much revenue, this much gross margin, this much net profit, this utilization rate, this average billable rate. So we have all of our kind of max targets that we could set, and we have the amount of cash flow that's going to generate for the business. You'd be amazed, Ryan, at how many times we get to the end of that process and there's this realization of like, oh, our business isn't capable of doing what we expect of it. It's like, okay, great. Let's start there. Let's start by solving that problem. So all of a sudden, something that for, in some cases, years has been framed as an execution problem, they realize is like, oh, it didn't matter how well we executed.
Yeah.
Yeah, we just were set up for failure from the start. We just didn't know. So that's the first thing, right? Do we have a business model?
Which hold that thought too. When dealing with people, when they come to this realization, because I get to the same situation, Marcel, when people realize that their business isn't worth what they thought it was worth. I mean, so similar situation where it's their they want a certain amount of distributions and a certain amount of equity growth, but they realize that they're locked into something that might not be able to produce that. It's a hard psychological situation. Like almost like I call it like stepping on the scale, looking in the mirror. How do you see or do you gravitate or do people gravitate towards you that are okay with that situation and that reconciliation because they're excited to execute, or do you have to have like a certain communication process around how to deliver that message, or does the data do
Yeah,
it?
it's mixed, but like generally speaking, it's a positive experience for teams. And unfortunately for us, there's a certain amount of willingness to engage with that reality that people have when they decide to write a check for someone to come in and expose them in this way, right? And so our experience is that once somebody is at that place and they make the investment to work with somebody like us, when we get to that moment, everyone's kind of prepared for it, and typically,
They're
it's very
looking for it. It
validating.
sounds like.
They are, yeah. And I think what it does is it just creates alignment very quickly. And it's this thing where it's almost like you take everyone that used to be sitting around the table arguing with each other about what's wrong, and you get them all sitting now on the same side of the table looking at data. And then the conversation is, okay, guys, what do we want to do together to like work on this and to go from where we are to where we want to go? And that's a really important shift. So I think we've been lucky that whether it's in, part of it is our facilitation, but I think just largely due to the fact that our clients show up ready to have that
Makes sense.
conversation, we've had good outcomes.
Well, and what I've always said to anybody that's engaging in a professional services firm, like the first step is writing the check, and you've by doing that said the status quo is no longer acceptable. So anything that you're getting should be movement towards progress. What's the so you had said that's the first thing. The second thing, so after the business model, and that's your
Yeah.
sequence.
So business model number one, what does good look like? What do we expect to happen? Step two is then forecasting. So the business model gives us a sense of over, some broad time horizon, what could we expect? Then forecasting becomes a question of, let's look at these KPIs that we have. Let's say it's how much revenue and how much agency gross income and how much delivery margin we want to accomplish, what our utilization rate is going to look like, and perhaps the margin that we're aiming for when we sell new things to new clients. Well, we can now look at that stuff into the future and ahead of time know if we're actually expecting to hit those targets or not.
Mhm.
So we're not surprised when we look at our income statement, 25 days after the month is done, looking backwards, we're like, oh shit, we missed our targets.
Mhm.
Who would have
Mhm.
thought? It's like, no, well, you knew that was going to happen ahead of time. So that's the second piece, is we now start forecasting. So everyone knows, are we on track? Are we not on track? Do we need to think about laying people off? Do we need to think about hiring people? Are we discounting too much? Is this a good time to accept a discount? Like, because those are the interesting things, right? When you're slow, maybe it does make sense to accept some revenue that's lower quality if it means you get to hang on to some good talent. If you're really busy, maybe it's not a good time to take that on. So the forecast is a second piece. And really, we want to do two forecasts at a high level. One is a financial forecast on an accrual basis that looks at what will our cost basis be on an accrual basis? What will our revenue earning look like on an accrual basis? And do the unique economics look good? And then a capacity forecast that helps us understand how much time is going to be required across a couple of large buckets within the organization, generally defined in terms of skill sets like design, project management, copywriting, et cetera. So we have an understanding of, is there anywhere that's going to be materially over or under capacity based on the work that we have coming in, so we can be looking around corners in terms of staffing, which is one of the most important levers for maintaining profitability in an agency, is balancing, how much labor you have available to what you're going to need.
Um, lots. There's a whole labor combo I want to touch on, but before that, so business model and the financial forecast, all I like the sequence, and it's all making sense to me. In there, is it the business model or the forecasting piece where you're having a conversation of, is your business model right model? Should you go from T&M to contract? Are you charging for assessments versus not assess? I mean, kind of maybe go back a step and like, what is the canvas? I know there's a canvas, but maybe it's blank about the different options that people can use to structure their services. And what do you like about varying options?
So, the model, we're more so dealing with like, what are you currently doing? We start to talk about pricing when we get into the forecasting piece. And part of that is where we really want to build out a scoping and pricing process that aligns to the structure that the forecast is going to come into. So here's the sneaky thing about installing the forecasting system is that it's actually also an exercise in data schema design. So some of the things that we're defining and structuring in that process is, okay, how do we think about capacity? What buckets are we going to break that down into that are standardized?
Yeah, it's got to go into rows and columns, right?
Right, exactly. Like there needs to be some structure, right? Are there different products or service lines that, you know, we're defining when we sell things? And then can we apply that same schema to our planned work so that when we sell something, we can plug it in and compare it to our capacity and they're not two different languages. And then like we take all of that upstream. So it's like, okay, when you sell something, let's start structuring it in this way from the start so it all flows through. And that is actually what sets the foundation for when we get to the last part, which is tracking actuals. How do we need to set that stuff up so we're getting the information that we need? Like, I think this is one of those cart before the horse things that a lot of people do is they go straight to tracking time and dialing in their P&L, but they've never stopped to think about, well, what kind of metadata do I need on a time entry? Because we didn't do this whole first part. So anyway, I digress.
TPS reports for TPS reports, Marcel.
Exactly. So
yeah,
back to the pricing question, right? So important conversation about pricing and scoping. The first one is, this is based on the model. What do we actually expect? What is good or what is bad on a pricing conversation? So generally we're trying to define what is the delivery margin or gross margin that we expect when we sell something, and exactly how are we calculating that? So now there's no more guesswork. There's no more idiosyncratic, you know, profitability measurement across different things based on the pricing model. And then the next question is, what is the pricing model that is most likely to consistently get us that gross margin or higher? So this is where we get into the pricing model quadrant. And typically the exercise we do is we have a client plot everything that they sell on this quadrant. So I'll describe the quadrant in a moment here. If you're a visual person, you can visualize this along with me. So we're drawing a quadrant. There's a vertical line going through the middle of your page. At the top of that line, you have high value. And at the bottom of that line, you have low value. So that's the first vector that we're going to evaluate services on, which is it high value or low value to the client specifically? So does the client think that this is valuable or not? And there's a lot of things that contribute to value, but the two most common ones are positioning, which determines, you know, how many alternatives does this client have to us to solve this problem. If I'm selling graphic design services, there's a lot of competition, right? Canva is a competitor to me. So I'm not really limiting a lot of options by having that positioning. But if my positioning is, hey, I help B2B SaaS companies visualize complex data systems using design, well, still graphic design, but it's a much narrower problem set. So that's number one. And then number two is relative impact. So if, for example, I have a client that does $100 million in revenue and I improve their website conversion by 1%, that's probably worth quite a bit of money to them. Whereas the same outcome, that 1% conversion rate increase for a company that does a fraction of that revenue, is not going to be the same impact. So we have to consider, what is the value of solving this problem to this client based on the impact it has on their business, the regulatory environment they're in, you know, the specific impact it has on their business model, whatever that might be. So that's all pretty standard stuff. We're talking about value a lot in pricing models. So the second thing that we have to consider, that I find firm owners, they inherently consider this, but it's often not like an overt thing that they're acknowledging, is risk, right? So if you draw that second line through across that middle line, on the right-hand side, you have low risk. And on the left-hand side, you have high risk. So what is risk? Well, risk is basically the degree to which you can predict what it will cost you to deliver this outcome to the client, right? And so on the low risk end, let's say you build landing pages for personal injury attorneys. If you've done 1,000 of those, you have a WordPress template, you have a process you go through, like it's super dialed in, you can predict to within 10 or 20% the cost that you're going to incur to deliver that outcome to the client. That is very low risk work. That's great. But let's say, for example, Elon Musk has rung you up and he goes, hey, I need you to write a control system to land a rocket on a barge in the middle of the ocean. Oh, and by the way, I want to use this new programming language that is new and has no documentation. It's not very well supported. I mean, you can't predict how long that's going to take. You don't even know if it's possible, right? And probably you're even going to have to use a process to solve that problem that is inherently iterative, like agile software development, for example, which just at a fundamental level should prevent you from trying to make too many assumptions up front, because it's like, it's just
you're going to be iterating.
Even do that.
Yep.
So I think one of the things that I really dislike about the conversation in pricing and agencies currently is that it makes selling time out to be this evil thing that you shouldn't do, you can't scale a business on, which is obviously not true because like the biggest consulting and professional services firms in the world still primarily bill on time materials. And when you tell someone like, hey, well, what about this risky work that I can't predict? You know, what if I can't put my stuff in a box? Their answer is, well, put it in a box and make it predictable. It's like, okay, well, that's not actually a good answer to that question. Like people still need complex shit to get done. And there's still a market in doing that.
I'm very appreciative of you saying that too, because one is it's a profitable business model. Like you can make really good money doing professional services, billing time and material, because you might not be, I mean, you don't have to buy a couple $1 million CapEx tool and die cutting machine. I mean, like there's a very good reason to do it. But also I think, Marcel, I see the same thing with like, just create recurring revenue. I mean, like, I hate it because like I love it. Obviously, I like recurring revenue, but like if I can get one of my clients who's got a steel bending job shop where they only get POs, but they can show the predictability of how much and how often they get those POs and how they can forecast budget to actual. Who cares if they got contracts? So I appreciate you saying that because I think so much of this is like, people just look at the internet of all the quick, easy things that you should be doing, but it kind of is decoupled from reality.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's more nuance to it. And to your point, there is a market for doing these things that are complex, that are unpredictable, that are these just kind of one-time large monolithic things. And there's money to be made there. So should we not just be having a conversation that's nuanced enough to say, hey, that's a reality and here are some ways to account for that? So that's what I'm hoping to accomplish with this pricing model quadrant. So back to summarizing this, we have value on the vertical axis. We have risk on the horizontal axis. So let's talk through how to approach each situation. We'll start on the right-hand side. So if you have low risk work that's low value, this is typically where flat rate or productized service pricing makes a lot of sense. So an example here would be you come to me and you say, hey, Marcel, I want you to build me a website. I might go, no problem, Ryan. It's $5,000 for the website and I'll get it done for you in 2 weeks. It'll be blazing fast, SEO optimized, proven to convert for your industry. What do you think? You'll probably say that's a great deal. $5,000 for a website. Awesome. Sign me up. Now, I might make $500 an hour building you that site because I have such a great process. It's predictable. So I'm arbitraging the low risk nature of that. I'm pricing the risk in and I'm hopefully capturing some additional upside that I might gain relative to if I try to ask you for $500 an hour, you might tell me to go pound sand.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So that's low risk, low value, high risk, high value, low risk, low value. So we're still on the right-hand side. So we did low risk, low value. Now we're doing low risk, high value. That's typically where you see value-based pricing come into the fold. So it's very similar often to flat rate pricing. The difference is what we're anchoring the price to. In the flat rate or productized service, we're anchoring the price to the deliverable. The website costs $5,000. In a high value, in a high value situation, we're trying to shift the anchoring of the price point to the outcome. So same conversation happens differently where you say, hey, Marcel, can I have a website? I might say, well, Ryan, tell me about your business. Tell me about your current website. Oh, interesting. You do $100 million in revenue and you get 80% of that through your website. Fascinating. What's your current conversion rate? Cool. How much do you think a new website would improve your conversion rate? Oh, interesting. So basically what you're telling me is you think a new website would add $10 million of revenue to your business next year. Very, very interesting. Do you think it would be fair to invest 10% of that upside in order to get that outcome? Right. So now all of a sudden I'm setting an anchor at $1 million for that same deliverable. Now I might not get $1 million, but that's the difference is I'm really trying to shift the conversation to the outcome. And there is a more extreme version of value-based pricing that you see a lot more in digital advertising agencies, which is outcome-based value pricing. So to take that conversation further, I might say, oh, interesting. You think this is going to add 10 million to your business next year. Why don't you pay me a flat fee of $5,000 for the website and then X% of every additional sale that you make above and beyond what you did last year attributed to the performance of this. Now, the nuance there and the reason very few firms actually get to that outcome is because first of all, you have to be able to measure the results. Easier said than done.
Right. Well, especially if your client, and going back, depends on like how long almost you specifically, like what Parakeeto is doing. Like if you have the tracking, the measurements and the controls and all that stuff, and you believe that the data coming in, what's going on is worthy of having that conversation. But yeah, I'm tracking you.
not non-trivial just to attribute and track the results, but let's assume that you can do that. Then the second thing is you have to de-risk not only the process but the outcome as well. So it takes a lot of maturity in a service offering to be able to price in the risk of doing something like that and not consistently end up on the wrong side of that equation where you're investing tons and tons and tons and tons of labor into this thing and you don't actually get the outcome, therefore you don't get paid. So it's high risk for a reason, and you typically want to make sure that you can very consistently come out on top on that. So that's the low risk stuff and the pricing models that we typically talk about. Let's talk about the high risk stuff. So high risk, low value. This is where time and materials, really selling hours, actually still works really well. I think has a lot of utility where maybe you came to me and said, Marcel, I need a website. And I go, okay, well, tell me about the requirements for the website. And you're like, well, honestly, I don't really know. And we have a whole bunch of new stakeholders joining the company and we're going through a rebrand. And so it's likely that that scope is going to be really fluid and change, but we just need to start making progress right now. And I go, cool, Ryan, like rather than us trying to make a whole bunch of assumptions, why don't we just put our, website development team on your account? They're $80 per hour. We can work roughly this many hours per month and just prioritize the backlog and keep working until you get to the outcome that you want. So that's like a nice way to actually account for the fluidity that's required in that engagement and work with the client. So you're not having to open up the scope of work every time something changes, which both of you are going to not enjoy. But if you can still maintain a strong margin on that hour, it doesn't really matter that there's variability as long as you're getting paid for that time and you make a good margin on that time. So there's not as much opportunity for upside, but the good news is there's also not as much opportunity for downside.
And if you notice, and maybe you're getting here because I know we got one more quadrant, but like I could see, because I did this with my last business where like you start doing one and then you get information, you get rapid feedback, and then you start figuring out how to move to a different quadrant.
100%. This is the natural progression of a lot of services and even client relationships is they'll start on the left-hand side of the quadrant and over time they'll kind of shift up and to the right.
Yep.
As you do more of that thing, you develop better processes around that thing, you develop a better understanding of the client's scope and their needs, you develop better case studies, better proof, right? Authority, like your positioning gets better over time. So this is a process, not necessarily an event.
Well, which makes so much sense, Marcel, because like, you and I have both been in charge of the revenue generation of professional services firm for most of our careers, it sounds like. And what I have learned is that like, I need to go through the shitstorm to get the stories to explain to someone when you're doing the outcome based or the flat rate, like here's why we're doing it. Here's what we're doing. Here's how would if you can't do that, then you're probably, if you can't clearly describe all that stuff, you're most likely you belong in the TNM to get that feedback and so you don't, maybe that's too much of an assumption, but
generally speaking, it's true. Like if you're going to do something for the first time, especially if it's something that's pretty novel, like it's pretty high risk. So either you accept that you're pricing a lot of risk into a flat fee, or you try to do it on more of a time and materials, or the next one we're going to talk about, which is actually one of the things we did for a long time at Parakeeto, in particular our implementation phases, because they were really complex and we hadn't done hundreds of them at that time, is abstracted time materials. So this is where you have high value and high risk work. So a really good example of this would be like the city of Baltimore. Maybe this is too soon, but they're like, hey, we need a new bridge. I don't know if you've heard, but the one we had,
it's not too soon. Come on,
went down, right? Okay, so cool. Like building a bridge for the city of Baltimore, that's high risk, right? Even just the amount of time you would have to spend to get to a reasonably accurate scope of what it's going to cost to replace that bridge is going to be millions of dollars worth of engineering bills, right? So rather than try to say, hey, here's what the new bridge is going to cost, probably what that engineering firm is saying is like, okay, here's our cross-functional engineering team. They cost $20,000 a month. And the current backlog of work that we have to do to go through all these different phases of designing and developing the bridge are going to take anywhere from 40 to 60 weeks worth of work. You could apply this to complex software products, complex website builds, right? Anything that's very technical and high value. It could even be like really complex business problem solutions.
So pretty much anything where you've got, you're building the scope with your team. Is that a fact for because construction projects, architecture, even IT infrastructure?
Yeah, just like super complex, technical, high value work that is either very unpredictable and or very fluid. And here's the funny thing, right, is if you've ever done, and I know you have, done work with enterprise companies, even a scope that seems like it's clear at the start is not going to be, because half the people that we're working on are going to get fired and replaced, right? The requirements are going to change. Like it's going to be unpredictable. And so the nice thing about this is you're still selling time. You're just abstracting it, and you're abstracting it across two vectors. The first is, what unit of time are you selling? You might go from selling hours to selling days, selling weeks, selling biweekly sprints, selling months, right? The time increment gets wider. So you have a bit of a rounder edge around that. And you actually have the opportunity to be more profitable within those units, where if you finish a week of work in 4 days.
So you're re-upping, or you're recalibrating your unit each time that unit is up. Is that what you're saying? So like every 2 weeks, you have the opportunity to kind of come back to the surface, or?
Essentially, yeah. So like, for example, a lot of agile teams, they'll do this. They'll sell 2-week sprints. So they're selling a 2-week sprint. That's the time increment they're selling, but then they're also abstracting from the individual. So the 2-week sprint is sold as a cross-functional team. So this software engineering team, which is 2 developers, an architect, a designer, a PM, right? They're $20,000 a sprint. So every sprint, they then fill with deliverables, and each of those deliverables is generally going to be expressed as a range of time units or story points or some other kind of measure of delivery. So they could still end up actually being more efficient on a per sprint basis than they had planned, and they get to capture a little bit of that upside. But the important thing is that sprint is sold in such a way that, again, they have a predictable margin. And the beautiful thing about these kinds of engagements, I know lots of people that have worked in this way, selling custom software development to the Canadian government, for example, where every time something changes, because things are going to change all the time, the answer isn't yes, but let us go dig up the scope of work and waste a bunch of time on that now. It's yes, and do you want that to happen before or after the other things that are in the backlog? Because it doesn't matter. You're going to get paid for those sprints.
Yeah. I like it. Super interesting, man.
So that's the pricing model quadrant. And really, again, the question is, you know what your delivery margin target is, which model is most likely to consistently, that's the important thing, consistently get you that margin or more.
Okay, this has been awesome, and as people are getting these puzzle pieces flipped up the right side, looking at the puzzle picture, and they're going through the sequence, at what would a monthly review, like, I'm just thinking about Marcel, and I'm biased because of my old business and where I'm coming from, is like, on a monthly basis, I just absolutely believe that every owner of a company should be able to have a meeting just like a PE firm. Like, there's no reason not to. The only reason not to is because the operational and the financial metrics and controls aren't in place. But like, if you're going to go through like a set of information, as you, like, let's say you own a portfolio of professional services firms, what would you want to see? And how would you handle that monthly meeting?
So generally, I mean, and this is basically how we run the meetings with our clients at Parakeeto. We basically start with an understanding of what did we expect to see over the last time period, let's call it a month, and what did we actually see? Where are the discrepancies? And then that generally leads to a conversation of, okay, where do we need to double click? So let's say, for example, hey, we planned for a 55% delivery margin. We ended up at a 52% delivery margin. Then we would double click into, okay, well, what was the issue? Was it utilization, average billable rate, or average cost per hour? So then we would double click on those metrics. We'd say, okay, we had a gap in our average billable rate. We might double click on that again and say, okay, it's this specific service line. We're chronically going over budget on projects in this service line. Then if there's a conversation about what do we do next? And that's where there might actually be a closing the loop on the model. So we might go, hey, I think we need to restructure this team over here that's delivering this service. What if we got rid of this role, had this person take this thing on, and we hired for this different role? And then we might go into our payroll grid and say, okay, let's model that change. Get rid of this person starting on this date, hire this new person starting on this date, move this person over here, change how many delivery hours are expected of them, change this person's salary. And then that would reset on this question of, okay, how does that impact all of our targets going forward? And we finish the meeting with saying, okay, here are the action items we're taking, and here are the results that we expect to see over the next month. And that is how we basically run that cycle: is what happened? What are we going to do about it? What are the implications of that? What are our expectations? And repeat.
I love it. What are some of the outcomes that you're seeing with agencies and professional services firms maybe two parts to this question. One is, how long does it take? Like, let's say they've got revenue as a GL code and then labor And so how long does it take, with the averages that you've seen of someone getting the controls in place, and then what are the outcomes afterwards? And is that fair to bucket that? Because I think saying, well, everybody averages this long, but everybody's data set and their controls are different than once they actually have the data set and controls.
I wouldn't be a consultant if I didn't answer at least one question today with "it depends." This is the one.
I'm making stats up. There we go. Yeah.
No, but it really does depend. So first of all, it depends on the approach. One of the things that we really pride ourselves on at Parakeeto is that we're not in the business of trying to go change how all of the source data is structured. So even when we're doing management accounting, we're not going to go fuck with the GL that's in the client's account. We're going to pull it all out, and we're going to use other methodologies to restructure that information and get management accounting.
Is that where your tech comes into play? So you're massaging all that in the text, so that way you don't have to be effing with the QuickBooks GL codes and all that stuff.
Exactly. And that allows us to get to these outcomes very quickly. So like we can do an assessment of a really big company in a week when it used to take us like months, because we'd have to fight with the accounting team to do a whole bunch of things they didn't want to do. At the end of the day,
I have to interject, because like my last two business models, Marcel, was one is we're going to build a custom spreadsheet for your trial balance and your GL codes. That is not fast. And then the second one is we're going to use your data, which is never right.
Yeah, never ever right. I think this is like, if there's one assumption that you should just let go of when you're trying to solve this data management problem in your business, is assume that the data will never be correct and assume that it will always be changing. So that immediately takes this idea off the table of let's just use like a Zapier to pipe all of this data from QuickBooks and Harvest and ClickUp and whatever our resource planning tool into a dashboard, because it's like that does not work, right? So you have to have an abstraction layer. Where were you a few
years ago, man?
Yeah. You have to have an abstraction layer. We built one. You want to talk to us about it? That's cool. There's other ones out there, but like that's the big idea. So, we can, in a matter of weeks, we can get all of this resolved, because we're not trying to like swim uphill here and change all the source data. We just pull it through a layer of abstraction and we transform it. If we have to make some changes to the source tools to get the right metadata, we will, but it's rare. And then in terms of the impact, it depends on what the problem is. The fastest thing to fix is a utilization problem, because you have the option of just letting people go. So unfortunately, again, simple but not easy. If you have a utilization problem and you can just lay some people off and then immediately correct your profitability, that's a pretty effective thing. If you have an overhead problem, that can often be a fairly quick thing to fix as well. You just go and cut a bunch of overhead expenses, although that's a very rare problem actually in professional services firms. The only time I really see overhead problems is when a firm grew really fast and then had to cut a bunch of headcount because the revenue kind of went the other way. They tend to be a little top heavy, but that's pretty much the only consistent situation where I see overhead be an issue. If you have an average billable rate problem or an average cost per hour problem, those things can take a little bit more time to funnel out of the business. And then it really comes down to how much of the work is project-based versus recurring. So if it's recurring, then it comes down to this question of how quickly can we close the utilization gap so that we can start replacing revenue. And the rate at which they replace revenue has a lot to do with the rate at which new business comes in. If they're more project-based, then it's a question of what is the rate at which new business comes in, as well as what is the kind of life cycle of a project. Are they selling things that take a week to deliver, or are they selling things that take 24 months to deliver? And that is really going to dictate what is the cycle of profitability improvement going to look for that organization. So it does vary quite a bit, but in terms of getting the initial insight into what the problem is, you're talking a couple of weeks if you're using the right approach.
So fascinating. And I'm validating everything you're saying, because I tried it all the hardest way, which is the opposite of what you just said. And yes, I can imagine that doing it that way is the right way. It's actually interesting because that Tracy, the 60-minute CFO gal that I'm referring a lot of my clients to, she's got a 3-statement template that's got just some higher level stuff, but then you're not having to go back to the source data and screw everything up. You're like, yeah, you have to run a couple things in parallel, but you're getting the data that you need. One thing that so like, as you're talking about doing all this, where does communication come into play? Because I can only imagine that you, as a consultant, like there's two different, like once you're getting this data, you're getting the plan, you're getting everything put together. It's like you have to communicate internally to team members, because it's all like the definition is it's a people business, right? So you have people and teams that are bought in and like got grooves of like what they're currently doing in their belief system. And then you have the clients that have been indoctrinated into your maybe bad habits and the shitty pricing services. So like, how the hell do you communicate internally and externally to make it actually all happen?
The first step is focus, right? And then the second step is then figuring out how to communicate that focus to the rest of the team, which of course gets very nuanced and gets into, leadership, organizational change management, all of these things that there's a lot of people out there that are far more expert in that than myself. But I think the most important thing is for you to really get clear on like what's the one thing that's most important for us to move, and then thinking through what does everybody's involvement in moving that in the right direction actually look like. And when it comes to something like a utilization rate, the unfortunate reality is that individual contributors in most firms have no real control over their utilization rate. And, we see this mistake all the time. We get to speak to an agency owner. We're like, hey, utilization rate's the problem. The first thing they want to do is turn around and go tell their team to get their utilization rate up. Well, it's like, well, if they just spend more time doing the same stuff they're doing right now, that's not actually going to help improve your profitability, but it will make everyone really stressed. It will make your clients think that they're getting a level of service that they don't actually get. Like, it will make things worse, but it won't make things better. So there's nuance to, I think, identifying what the problem actually is and where the focus needs to be, and trying to really get it down to like one important thing, being clear about where the outcome is, and then really being thoughtful about, okay, what are the actions we're going to take, and how does each person in the company actually contribute to that? And it might be that there's a lot of people in the organization that don't actually have a whole lot of pull. Like, in utilization is one of those things where it's like beyond the management team, there's not a whole lot anybody else can do about this, because it's up to you as a management team to decide
To structure it all the right way.
to structure your team, who to hire, who to fire, and when to keep those people around or when to bring more people on, and how to balance that relative to the work that's coming in.
Well, and what I've realized, dude, is like that, and that leadership's ability to communicate why change is happening is so important. Holy buckets. I mean, I've watched with my old partner. I mean, his ability to communicate was unbelievable. Stuff that I was like, I don't know how we're gonna make it through this. Like, and just the communication ability, like, can be huge. And you know, and I know that you said that it's potentially for someone that's in change management, leadership, and all that stuff. But like, how much, like, if you were to look at like your clients, the people you've worked with, like, if they were to do all the mechanics, like, what's harder for a lot of people? Is it what you're helping people with, or is it the people side?
It's interesting. Like, I found that a lot of the firm owners that we've worked with that have had success, two things tend to be true about them. They're often very, very good at their craft, which is the reason they got into the business in the first place. And they do have an affinity for people, which is the reason that they've been able to build generally a very talented team, and often very committed teams. Like, a lot of the clients that we work with, if I really think about it, they don't have a whole lot of challenges with employee turnover. A lot of them had people working with them for a very long time. And so I think these are things that come very naturally to them. The numbers.
Is it more, sorry to interrupt, but is it more, I would see it's almost more loyalty issues where like there's bad people and they're too loyal, or is that not as much as we?
I don't know that that's the case. Like,
Interesting.
yeah. I mean, certainly in some situations, like there are team issues, but I would say that the common thread is that like our clients have great teams, really talented, engaged people. They're really good at the work that they do, right? These are all the reasons that they've been growing a business largely off of referrals. Is like, they're nice people, they do great work, and clients love them. And it's the business side of running the business that just never came naturally to them, and they never got an education on it. And so that's what's most overwhelming to them. And their challenge is they feel like they're doing everything right. They do great work for great clients. They have a great team, great environment. People love working there. They're busier than they've ever been. They have more clients than they've ever had. And yet, where's all the money? And they can't quite solve that problem. And they start pulling on the thread. And as we kind of talked about at the very start of this episode, all of a sudden it gets really complicated really fast. So I would say that this is like the thing that universally people struggle a lot with. And it's very rare that we run into a team that once they feel like there's clarity on what's actually going on, they don't all just want to get on board and solve it.
Super cool. That's awesome. That's well, because then that just means that, because I've been a part of or seen or been exposed to, like, when the people thing it can become very, very difficult. If there's the wrong people, wrong spots, wrong business model. I mean, there's a lot of finessing that have to go through that. But
I think part of it too is intention, right? So I've also seen, and I think the advertising industry was famous for this in the past, people using this in a nefarious way. Like I've seen lots of agencies from times of old that their business model was hire young, talented, vulnerable people, overwork the hell out of them, right? Get them working 80, 90 hours a week. And that helps subsidize underpricing things, et cetera. So like,
I think you just described the entire CPA and legal industry, to be honest.
yeah, I think a lot of consulting firms probably run this way still, but like,
I just saw a CPA firm post on LinkedIn. It's like our new hires. And it was like, they were still wet behind the ears. And it was like 25, 22-year-olds. And I texted to one of my buddies. I'm like, don't worry. They're all getting billed out at 250 to businesses right now.
100%. Yeah. For 60 hours a week.
Yeah.
And so like there is a wrong way to do this. I think it all comes down to the intention. And I think we've just been very lucky that the vast majority of our clients just, they want to do this for the right reasons, right? It's not.
Do you find the correlation is because I've found this with the education first that I've had, Marcel, is that like people that want to educate and they've just kind of already self-selected. I'm willing to do hard work. They usually have the right intentions and they're trying to do they got into the professional services to help their clients, to solve a problem, not to make a bunch of money, because it's really hard to do it in professional services in any business. But there's kind of an alignment and correlation of a lot of good values.
Totally. And they see that like being, there's nothing noble about being constrained financially in your professional services firm. You can't serve your employees and you can't serve your clients properly if you're constantly in a place of financial scarcity. So like it is the socially responsible thing to do and the fiscally responsible thing to do is to make sure your business is profitable, you have a good amount of optionality and comfort and security. And then you're actually in such a better position as the owner of that business to do right by all the other people that are involved in that thing. And so I think that's really the reason that people come to us, is that they recognize that they've been constrained. It's negatively affecting them and their teams. And they just want to be in a better position to do the thing that they set out to do when they started the business, was like do good work, serve great clients, and
simple
be happy
questions
and rewarded for their risk.
Simple questions, difficult ways to get those answers. And like what I think is so encouraging, which is why I wanted you on the show, and I'm excited about what you're doing, is there's no way to decouple your operating role from the business ownership if you don't have these controls in place. I mean, like the way to actually feel comfortable of stepping back and being able to collect some distributions from your business while someone else is taking over, whether it's sales like in your position or ops, delivery, or whatever it is that, the professional services more so than ever than every other business is a reflection of that individual's identity. So the problem becomes more entangled than like, so I just think the data and the clarity of this allows someone to then have the confidence to say, okay, like I can start stepping back a little bit, because that's the whole reason, like, I mean, to do the things that you want to do and not get, swallowed up by your operations.
And it's so true, because if I think about the inflection points that we hear of the reason why someone reached out and finally booked a conversation with us after following us for years and listening to our podcast, it almost always correlates with these plateaus in a professional services firm where they're building out another layer of management. First one's at that like 10 to 12 people range. The next one's at that 20 to 30 range. The next one's at that 50 to 60 range, right? So every time that new layer of management comes in, it radically exposes the fact that there's no objective measure of like how we're performing. There's no clear expectations. It's like there's no alignment in terms of what those things mean, how to hold people accountable. And so it's really, really tough, to your point, to put people in charge, to give them feedback on how they're performing, and for you to have some way to assess that without being, breathing over their shoulders all the time. So it
can be out of fear, right? Because like the only reason you're going to do that next layer, like you said, and I've been in that situation, and I don't know if I've ever I've came out the other side a couple times. It wasn't as many times as I wish it was, because like you're that next layer is a huge layer of investment that sucks up your cash flow, and the only reason you're going to do that is to get a return of time and cash flow and equity. Otherwise, you might as well stay smaller. So like you're giving people the confidence and the data that they need to make sure that the return that they're doing and the risk that they're taking, they're getting a return. Otherwise, I mean, yeah, Let's get the guesswork out of it, right, man? I know I've been barring your ear for too long because you're a little under the weather. I'm excited that you're able to still jump in and chat about KPIs and finance. What's your goal, Marcel? Like with the book, with all, like, you've really hit liftoff since I met you. So like, what's your aspirations for everything?
My next step is to, the first book that came out was Software as a Service. That was kind of a passion project with SaaS Academy, specifically focused on software founders. The next thing that I want to do is write a book for professional services firms and really put a stake in the ground and say, this is the framework for how to measure a professional services firm in 2025 and beyond. And, my goal is to have it be the definitive guide for the next several decades, and it kind of have a similar impact on small business owners that something like Profit First had, but really taking it to another level of nuance and actionability. Um, and ultimately, I think what I want to do with Parakeeto is just leave an impact on this industry and empower everybody to gain the level of mastery over their business that like has you sleeping better at night and has you feeling like the business is happening for you and not to you. And it's very elusive today. And I feel like there's so many other industries where, this stuff is so much easier. You take it for granted. Like SaaS, you plug Profit well into your Stripe account, and all of a sudden you have all the analytics that you need. And yet in professional services, like we're flying blind all the time. So I'm really on a mission to solve that problem because I think it can have such a massive impact. Like you think about how much of the economy is services, you think about all the businesses that those services support, all the people that those businesses employ. If we can make that a more viable industry going forward, because we know the margins are getting tighter and tighter and tighter, and the level of sophistication required to survive is getting higher and higher. If we can empower those people to continue to thrive, then I'll feel really good about the impact that we've had. So that's why I get up every day and keep pushing.
It's awesome, Marcel. And I want to help you guys spread the word too, because I also, to add to that level of impact, when I look at the baby boomer transition that's going on and like people that are our age and below, what the hell are you going to do to generate wealth? And I'll tell you what, you can go, like, when you look at, I mean, it's entrepreneurship. I mean, like, it's that, or it's sales. I mean, like, to actually get ahead. I mean, like, and God bless the W-2 workers, but like, I mean, there's only so many ways to get ahead of the need for wealth to buy the freedom that you want. And I think about, like, okay, well, if someone's going to start in entrepreneurship, are you going to go buy $5 million of steel and bending cutting machines? Or are you going to go buy, $2 million worth of inventory? Or like, I mean, so professional services, the first, if someone has a skill set, someone has a problem, and they can get in fast. But then if they have a roadmap, like you're building out, like, hey, get in, do the T&M, and then learn, and then generate. But don't just get to this point where you're hoping, like, I'd say it's even more advantageous to people that are looking to get into entrepreneurship. So anyways, I think you're doing some real good work, man.
I'll plant a seed for maybe the next 90-minute conversation that we can have. But I really feel like, just at a first principles entrepreneurship level, services are one of the greatest mediums for finding product market fit and solving hard problems ever. And it's a way that you can do it without raising external capital. You can fund your own R&D just by charging. It's a big idea, but it's exactly what we've done at Parakeeto to build a proprietary tech company without raising money. So, I'm so bullish on services going forward, and I just really want
or content, even if it wasn't SaaS or something. Like, I mean, like, you're learning what the true problems of people's shit are, and then you're solving them with them, and then you can, it's Marcel. Thank you so much for what you're doing in the entrepreneur space, man. I appreciate it and appreciate your time. Where can people find you?
Yes, they can find us at parakeeto.com. We publish a ton of free stuff. If you want to grab a bunch of free tools that we've designed to help you start measuring your profitability, you can get those at parakeeto.com/toolkit. And if you love podcasts and you thought that this was really nerdy and fantastic, then check out the Agency Profit podcast. You'll never guess what we talk about there.
Marcel, thank you so much, my friend. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Ryan.